Okay. All right, Acts 21. Acts 21. The idea is that Paul is, one thought is that he is willing to shave his head and then perform this vow and all that. He's fulfilling his becoming all things to all men. That's where we left it off last time. At 1 Corinthians 9, verses 20 through 23. Why don't we, let's go there just for the fun of it. 1 Corinthians 9. Through 23. And unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. I mean, that just fulfills that right there. In them that are without law, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. Meaning the Gentiles. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. So we do that. We should, we don't have to be hard fast on all kinds of stuff. And not that we wink at it, but that you want to win people over. It's kind of like my teacher. My teacher says, well, he does not play the acoustic guitar. I don't play the acoustic guitar. I play electric guitar. Would there be some preachers that would have a hard time with that? They would have a real hard time with that. And then they, I don't know if it's Les Paul. Who developed the solid guitar? Well, somebody did it.
Fender, Les Paul, yeah.
Les Paul, somebody, he was talking about him. You know, I could just come back and say, well, that's of the devil, and on it goes. He says, he wants to play rock and roll, but I play country to get paid. He won't get paid if he plays rock, but that's what he wants to play. And he does know what he's doing. Those that are teaching, let's say they're teaching guitar and they've been doing it for a long time, it's acoustic guitar, and they're playing really, really well, as you and I would consider well. Then you have some young guy come in there and say, I want to learn rock, and they think they can't do it, but they can do it. You know, if they're really good at it. But anyway, you don't turn people off by that. Otherwise you push them away and you close the door. And it's hard then to win them over. All right, his conscience is clear. That's where we're going to pick it up today. Father, bless our lesson today and the understanding of your word, Father, that we would use this, Father, as strengthening our faith now. In Christ's name, amen. Having a clear conscience is oh so important. You know, those that are in politics, and things come up in politics where lately, let's say there's some kind of a scandal in politics, and then everybody comes out against that person. And then you find out 6 months go by, and then some of the people that came out against that person, the same accusations are made against them. Well, they must know that they're guilty. They're better off just to keep their big flapper shut.
Their brains are seared.
Oh, and their brain is seared, yeah, seared conscience. Yeah, it does bring up that word conscience there, seared, having a seared conscience. Yeah, but how dumb. I mean, if you're guilty of the same thing when they pillow their head, if their conscience is not seared, they're having some sleepless nights.
Throws the pressure off of them.
Yeah, right, if they have a seared conscience. But if you didn't, every time you pillowed your head, you'd say, uh-oh, I'm next. Well, Acts 23, verse 1. And Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. Acts 24, verse 16. And herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. So that really is important. And, that would be your lifestyle. It makes it so that you can sleep at night. And when are there going to be accusations? Yeah, there's going to be accusations. But they'll be not able to hold any truth to it, right? They accused Jesus of everything. They accused him of all kinds of things. Verse 27 of Acts 21. And when the 7 days were almost ended, almost, is what we're looking at. The Jews which were in Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him. So divine intervention, preventing Paul from making any sacrificial offering in case he was going to cross the line. That's one of your take on that there could have been a divine intervention there. All right. And I know I had one out of place here. Okay, the restriction of Paul. And I did misspell a word here. Okay, the restriction of Paul. Again, nothing changed from 9 years previous. Verse 25. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and conclude, this is what they're telling Paul, that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. So the restriction of Paul that was set up 9 years previously to this in Acts 15, considered the council of the Jerusalem Council. In fact, let's go back there, Acts 15, 19, and 20. Acts 15, 19, and 20. Wherein my sentence is that we trouble them not, which from among the Gentiles are turned to God, but that we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols, and from fornication, from things strangled, and from blood. So those restrictions that were given, they were still in place, and basically nobody's moved off of that, and growing in grace and so on. The resistance now given Paul, they resisted him, verses 27 through 30. When the 7 days, we already read verse 27, crying out, Men of Israel, help. This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law in this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus and Ephesion, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. So it's just packed out with a bunch of Jews. and they're all against Paul. So almost as it begins here, divine intervention, they saw him. Paul was recognized by some old enemies. He's recognized. You know, when he goes in Acts 28, did they hear of Paul in Acts 28? Did they hear of Paul? Remember, he assumed they heard of him. They said, no, we haven't heard of this. We've heard of this sect that everywhere it's spoken against, but we really haven't heard anything said about you. So it wasn't like this news spread everywhere. But he had old enemies. They saw him. In verse 27, they laid hands and they stir up the people. Verse 27, 28, and 30. And I don't know why I asked that question. How? I guess this is the how. Is help. They need help in doing this. Like all communists, they use the phrase the people to get the support they need. Yeah, isn't communism always about the people? It's about the people. And by the way, then, who's the last people that, in the end, to be helped?
The ones who need it the most.
The ones that need it the most. Aren't communists in power in Venezuela?
Yeah. The socialists and communists. Yeah.
The socialists, communists, that type of government. What's the difference between that and fascism? What's the main difference? There is a difference. They usurped the power, yeah, and then they probably hid it by having the brown shirts. They set the fire. They burnt the Rhine. They burned something to the ground, and they blamed the communists, didn't they? Didn't they burn the Rhine? The Congress, or they burnt the building down, but they blamed somebody else for it.
They did that stuff all the time.
They did what?
They did that all the time. They did it. They blamed everybody.
They blamed other people, but then you said they used military force.
Yeah.
But then what's the difference between, once the government is set up, what's the difference? Doesn't a fascist permit some private ownership? Well, I know I thought communists do not. I thought fascists do.
Well, one's an economicist and a fascist is just a jerk. Does whatever they want.
A fascist does whatever he wants.
He could let some capitalism exist, but it's all to his pleasure.
Okay, and a communist, then what's that?
Well, it's an economic system.
Everything's controlled by the government, correct? No?
Either way, it's lose-lose for who?
There's no picnic for the little guy.
For the little guy. I thought I heard in Venezuela, 1/3 of the people, 1/3 of them are willing to, they want to leave the country. I thought it's 1/3. I don't know how many live there. I thought it's like 8 million people want out. They want political asylum, or what do they call that when they're trying to get out of there? Well, what's the reason? They're starving. I know when Marie was here, anybody remember, what was her husband's name? He worked in the ER over at, up north here at the hospital on Mayfield Road. No, over there in Mayfield. Hillcrest. He worked over there. What's his name? He lives in Solon. You guys, I can't think of his name right now. He was, his brother came here. I used to drive him every week.
I will,
He's the one that gave me all the guns. I drove him here forever. People would take him on his cars. He owned a lot of cars and never owned any. The bank, Wells Fargo owned them. I can't think of his name right now. Anyway, at that time they said that they were in the mountains. They would come, it was every man for himself in the mountains. They would come down into, what's the capital, Caracas? And they would try to work, and they were starving then. They were starving back then. And who was the dictator then? It wasn't this guy. Chavez? Chavez, yeah. So it's always about the people to get the support they need. They get the support they need. We as Christians need the Lord's help, as did Peter when he began to sink in the water. Amen. Lord, save me. Man, there's some situations. The only saving you could do is you hope that in war the lucky ones are the ones that got shot if you were a Christian. All right. Verse 28. The thing is, and the claim is that Paul is against the people. The claim is that he's against the people. By claiming Paul was against this place. All right, the people, the place. By claiming Paul brought Greeks into the temple to pollute the place. Those that would be Gentiles. Only Jews would be permitted in there. By claiming Paul had polluted the holy place. All that is in there in verse 28. Claiming all those things. And all their claims are unproven. You want to have proof. They're just hoping something sticks to the wall, right? That there is no proof. And so all their claims were unproven. Verse 30, Paul's then taken by the mob and shut the temple doors behind him and prepared to kill him in verse 31. As they went about to kill him. And man, they didn't waste any time. Judge, jury, and executioner, right? What do you call that? Mob rule, lynch mob, huh? Kangaroo court. Any other name? Lynch mob, kangaroo court. It's sedition, taken by the mob. They shut the temple doors behind him, and they get ready to do him in. They want to do him in. In the Old Testament, how would you stop a war? And who would you kill? As a general rule.
the leader.
You kill the leader, and it ends. Everybody goes back to their own tent. All right, and then Paul is rescued. Number 11 in our words. Just remember, there are no paragraph markings from Acts 20 on. The last ones are found in Acts 20. So the rescue of Paul. Paul is rescued here by the Romans. I mean, you got strange people to do. God uses the world to rescue you. Right? He uses the chief captain here of the Romans to rescue him. The Romans reacted quickly because Jerusalem had become a powder keg. They want to have peace. Who here wants to have turmoil? Don't you want your house to be just even a little bit of heaven on earth, right? A little bit of heaven on earth, you want peace. Some people aren't even at peace even if they're alone. Isn't that too bad? People are, even if they're alone, they're not at peace. They got frustration, anxiety, and so on, and they don't have inner peace. Best way to have inner peace is to have the one who lives inside, and that's Jesus Christ. Amen. So Jerusalem is filled with those seeking to overthrow Rome. Verse 38. Art not thou that Egyptian which before these days madest an uproar and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? So there's a lot of people that are jumping to conclusions. And so people wanted to overthrow Rome. How long did Rome last, by the way? I think Dana's right. It's more like 1,000 years.
Yeah, I was gonna say around 700.
Well, let's call it 1,000 years.
Yeah, I think the Roman Empire ended here.
Then it splintered off, and then how did it splinter off at the end, politically and religiously? Constantine, or wasn't that something to do with the Pope? That got involved in it, and it kind of splintered off. And then I know I saw a film on that about Rome at the end. One way you can tell a declining nation is by its architecture. Is it became cheap, dirty, straight lines. We skipped the carving.
They replaced the French curve with a ruler.
Yeah, you make it a straight line, cheap, dirty, get it up, slap it up. And then I'm sure it was destroyed from within, and not so much from without. And by the way, the more area you control, the more out of control it can be, right? You know, it's like World War II. What was the main mistake Germany made?
They out-advanced their supply line.
All right, well, those are the practical ones. Let's get to the spiritual one. What was the main one they made the mistake in? What did he say? No, the spiritual one. The Jews. They attacked the Jews. Now the practical side. You got supply lines that are 1,000 miles between there and the front. You know, they tried to take over the world all at one time, and they had all the wrong allies.
During the winter.
And you do half of it during the winter, you know. All right. In just 10 years, Jerusalem would be destroyed by the Romans under Titus. So the looming destruction is coming. In this rescue of Paul, I did this is the end. This is the end here of Acts 21 here. This verse 31 and 32, the caution. Let's just go ahead and read it. As they went about to kill him, tidings came into the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers, centurions, ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating him. I have to be honest, I didn't look up this outline they had, but they exercised caution. The capture. The chief captain came near and took him, so they captured him. They took him into custody and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. The confusion. Some cried one thing and some another among the multitude. When he could not know the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. So there's a lot of confusion. When you go to court, that is to untangle the confusion. Now, how do you untangle the confusion at court? Witnesses on the stand. They have to, corroborate one another, back it up. And what are the facts? What are the facts? So there's a lot of confusion. When they came upon the stairs, so it was that he was born of the soldiers for the violence of the people. I mean, they get angry. Jewish people can get that way. Certain groups of people can lose their temper easily. Different groups. Can you think of a calm group? Is there a calm group of people? You think Orientals? Well, man, if you had the wrong last name in the Boxer Rebellion, you were dead.
No, it's wrong.
Amish are calm people. Yeah.
Yeah, Quakers, Amish.
Unless you're 18 years old and you're doing what they call exercising your wild oats. But I would say Amish people are calm people. But a lot of confusion, and people can get violent. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying away with him. So a lot of confusion. Paul was to be led in the castle. He said unto the chief captain, May I speak unto thee? Who said, Canst thou speak Greek? And then this is the crime that he is accused of, that he is that Egyptian. So there's an accusation here of a crime. Now the craftiness, and not in a bad way, I would assume I wrote this down in a good way, is Paul uses his cleverness or a way of having the opportunity in which to preach. So craftily, when he speaks to the chief captain, may I speak unto thee, who said, Canst thou speak Greek? So he assumed he could only speak Hebrew, being a Jew. But he assumed he was an Egyptian. And what do Egyptians speak? Egyptian? Arabic? And so he speaks Greek to him, and he said, wow, you can speak Greek? And so to communicate, and then in verse 39, I'm a man, Paul said, I'm a man, I beseech you. He wants to speak unto the people in verse 39, a citizen of Cilicia, and he had given him license. That's the only place, by the way, I believe that's the only place that appears in the Bible. Who was jailed for preaching without a license? No. He could have been. Pilgrim's Progress. What's his name? John Bunyan. He was jailed for not having a license. I know I read some of these old books. I have some, and you would think I would have first editions. Man, some of these books, they're already 200-300 years old. It's the 8th edition. It's not the first edition. Then you read the bio on it, and man, this guy is really, really good. And I think a lot of them are Puritans, and then they're kicked out. They lose their place. They are removed. And a lot has to do with the queen. Whoever the queen is, whoever the king is, if they're sympathetic with Rome, and these things change, and man, they just gave them the boot. And they lose their bishopric, they lose their position. And I would assume it's dealt with around politics and religion. And some of these guys lose their place. I think when I heard stories of great Christians, you wouldn't think that Jonathan Edwards would lose his place. I think he preached for 10 years at the famous church. He did nothing there, but he would just show up and preach it. I think they said on the stories of great Christians that people were fighting like mad. And they fired him. He lasted 10 years. They fired him. He went to the Indians and became a missionary. And then he got the job at Harvard or Yale, one of those places. And then within a year or two, he died of smallpox. I'm pretty sure. I could be wrong, but he then beckons with a hand unto the people when they made a great silence, verse 40. He spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue. Now, obviously, and we call it craftiness, at least that's what I call it. Would you speak to the Jews in German? obviously he wouldn't be, it's obvious. He would speak to them in the language they would understand, not in a language they wouldn't understand. So he is bilingual, at least in 2 languages, and for all I know, he could speak more than that, and so on. So the rescue, Paul is rescued. God can intervene. I would assume Paul was amazed that he was rescued. They're ready to tear him apart. Later on, maybe in the next chapter or 2, he gives testimony, and they bring him down into where the Jews, and this is where he's really crafty, is he preaches the resurrection of the dead to get the Sadducees fighting against the Pharisees, because the Pharisees believe in the resurrection. The Sadducees do not, and it says that they would have pulled him apart. So one was pulling him one way, and one was in support of him, one was trying to do him in, and they would have pulled him apart. That's where he's really, really crafty in using reasoning in which to get to be heard and to be found innocent. But I would assume he was amazed. Wow, I got saved here. I thought I was a goner, right? So when you think at times when you're at your lowest ebb, is you are God can intervene and save you out of a predicament that you may be in. And we are done early today, 5 minutes early. Usually I'm 5 or 10 minutes after. Anybody have questions?
You're not calling us turkeys, are you?
Say that again?
You're not calling us turkeys, are you?
I can't.
Are you calling us turkeys?
Turkeys?
Yeah. Turkeys are dogs. People
God,
are finished.
Oh. All right. Well, remind me to laugh. All right. Any questions or no? Yes, sir. Very possible. Well, he spoke Greek to the. By the way, why would he speak Greek and not Latin to that guy? Now that Dana brought that up, obviously he spoke Greek and not Latin. But why was it that the Roman centurion spoke Greek and not Latin? In the next, remember what he said about how he obtained his freedom?
He bought it.
He bought it, which would have meant he wasn't freeborn, which would teach salvation anyway. But he wasn't a Roman citizen by birth. He was from someplace else speaking, I would assume speaking Greek, and not having been born a Roman, speaking Latin as an example. So that is wherever he made that purchase, that's the language, probably Rome conquered it, and that was the language that the Roman centurion understood. And he was probably recruited to keep the peace there. He would know the culture of the people, etc., in whatever location they were in. Obviously, they're in Rome here, though. Obviously, they're there. Father, bless now the preaching and following. In Christ's name, amen. Amen.